Welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast, all about improving the lives of animals with better policies and practices in government and business. Brought to you by Animal Wellness Action, where we believe helping animals helps us all. Here's your host, Joseph Grove.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast. I'm Joseph Grove. Today, we're exploring a question that sits at the very heart of our relationship with animals, a question so familiar that most of us rarely stop to examine it. Why do we love some animals as family, but treat others as commodities? Why do we cherish dogs, recoil at the idea of eating them, and yet accept, often without reflection, the suffering and slaughter of pigs, cows, chickens, and fish? Now, at Animal Wellness Action, our approach begins with realism as well as compassion. We recognize that many people eat animals. Many on staff do. I'm embarrassed to admit this in front of our guest. I do too. And we do not divide the world into the morally righteous and the morally fallen. But what we do insist on is a clear ethical baseline. If animals are raised for food, they deserve lives free from needless suffering, fear, and deprivation. If there must be a bad day, it should be one day, not a lifetime. That principle alone raises difficult questions. Why are some forms of suffering normalized while others provoke outrage? Why do certain practices remain invisible even to people who care deeply about animals? Those questions are central to why we love dogs, eat pigs, and wear cows, a landmark book that introduced the concept of Carnism, the invisible ideology that conditions people to eat certain animals while loving others. The author of that book is our guest today, Dr. Melanie Joy, Ph.D., a Harvard-educated psychologist, international trainer, and one of the most influential thinkers in modern animal ethics. She is the author of 8 books, including Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, but also Beyond Beliefs and How to End Injustice Everywhere. She is also the founding president of Beyond Carnism. Today, we'll talk with Dr. Joy about how invisible belief systems shape our behavior, why challenging them often triggers defensiveness, and how advocates can speak about animals in ways that invite reflection rather than resistance. So, Dr. Joy, thank you. I'm really very excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. And I really appreciate your openness about the issue and how, you acknowledge it's a challenging conversation to talk about our contradictory relationships with animals, especially among people who really care about animals. And I can relate to that because that's sort of how I came to this work myself.
As I've talked about in some other shows, it really is one of the great hypocrisies of my life, and I confront it all of the time, but apparently not with enough energy that I'm able to make that leap. That the laziness, that the extra work that eschewing all animal products would entail, unfortunately, doesn't in practical terms surmount the love I have for animals. I don't know that I said that right, but it's a problem. And of course, many welfare organizations do require their employees to be vegan. PETA, for example, I think is one of them. But Wayne Pacelle, our president and founder, has preached that one bad day, if we're going to do it, let's just make sure that we take darn good care of them and keep them comfortable and healthy until that one day comes. But enough about us. Enough about me, Dr. Joy. So Carnism. Tell me a little bit about your own personal journey to where you are now.
Definitely. And I mean, you just raised so many great points and so many great issues. And I think, you're speaking to obviously what's at the heart of my work and my experience beyond my work is that many, many people, the vast majority of people do live with this feeling of cognitive dissonance, right? This internal discomfort when our values, believing that non-human beings, animals should be treated with compassion and kindness, and our behaviors, which is to support the slaughter of animals through our food choices. And the good news is that there's a lot of nuance around this and ways to reconcile that conflict that may may be surprising to some people. But let me talk a little bit about my story and really what I would like to, be focusing on today, which is you raised this issue about, there are a lot of great reasons for why, and a lot of information out there about why animal agribusiness is problematic. And my work has looked not simply at why we, quote unquote, shouldn't eat meat, but why we do eat meat in the first place. Because this is one of those obstacles, as you bring up. What are the obstacles? What's getting in the way of me living in alignment with my core values? Like, what is it that's preventing that? And so my story is not really dissimilar from yours in some ways. I also, I was always a person who cared about animals. I would never have wanted animals to suffer, to contribute to that suffering, especially when the suffering is so extensive and intensive and really completely unnecessary. And yet for a lot of my life, I ate animals. And over the course of, many years and many meals, I actually never even thought about how strange it was that I could be petting my dog with one hand while I ate a pork chop with the other. A pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as sentient and intelligent as my dog. I didn't make the connection between the meat on my plate and the living being it once was. And all of that changed in 1989. I was 23 years old and I ate a hamburger that was contaminated with a very dangerous bacteria, and I wound up hospitalized on intravenous antibiotics. I was like wildly ill. And after that experience, I went off meat. Not because of any conscious ethical concerns, but rather, when the last thing you eat makes you so wildly ill, you're like, oh my God, I'm never touching that again. So that I kind of became a vegetarian by accident.
I wish bourbon had done that for me back in the day. If I had had your reaction to bourbon, a whole lot of trouble would have been prevented. But I digress. Sorry, Dr. Joy.
Well, if you drink enough of it, you can bring that on. But yeah, so I became a vegetarian by accident, and I had to learn about my new diet, right? How to cook, how to eat. This is back in the 80s, right? This is 1989, so there was a lot less known then than is known now. But anyway, I inevitably stumbled upon information about animal agriculture, and what I learned shocked and horrified me. And I became vegan shortly thereafter, after having met a vegan, but I could not believe the extent of harm to animals. I could not believe the extent of harm to the environment, to my body, to public health, all the things that we now know a lot more about. I was learning about. But what shocked me in some ways even more was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. The response was always something like, don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal, or they'd call me a radical vegan hippie propagandist, and these were compassionate, rational people. They were like my family members and my close friends. They were people who cared about animals and their impact on the world, just like I had been when I was eating animals. But this wall went up, and I became very curious as to how, when it came to this extremely important issue, people could just stop thinking and caring, just shut down their critical thinking and their empathy. And this eventually led me to my doctoral research. I studied broadly the psychology of violence and nonviolence. Now, my question was how can caring people, who have strong moral foundations, nevertheless support something that is completely contradictory to their own integrity, to what they believe is right and what they feel good about? How is that possible? And what is it that causes people to support this industry, that causes them to act against their values, but also their own interests without realizing what they're doing? And so I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating animals. And as I was doing my research, I was talking to meat eaters and people who raised and killed their own animals for food, and butchers and vegans and vegetarians as well. I realized that everybody I talked to had exactly the same contradiction they were living with. Everybody I talked to felt bad about the fact that they were supporting harm to animals, suffering and harm to animals. And they were using these psychological strategies to manage that discomfort that they were experiencing internally. And I realized that, I wasn't just randomly, this group of people that I was interviewing and I had surveyed, they represented something much bigger, right? And that something much bigger was going on than just a few people having, contradictory attitudes and behaviors. these contradictions could only exist in a widespread belief system. And that was what led me to identify what I came to call Carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. And I think I should probably unpack this a little bit for listeners, because I'm sure this is, new information for many people. Carnism is basically the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system. But the only reason that we might eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity for survival, which is true for people who can afford to make their food choices freely, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. But we're so indoctrinated, we're so deeply conditioned to think of certain types of animals as food that we don't even realize that we're making a choice when we're eating them. Eating animals just seems to be like a given. It's just the way things are. And carnism it's a global phenomenon, right? In meat-eating cultures around the world, people learn to classify a small handful of animals as edible. All the rest they classify as inedible. And members of all cultures tend to find their own choices to be rational, and the choices of other cultures to be irrational and disgusting, and often even morally offensive. So, for example, if you imagine that you're biting into a juicy hamburger, and your dining companion turns to you and says, "Okay, Joseph, actually, that hamburger is made from golden retrievers." So chances are, I can tell by your face, like what you just thought of as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. So therefore, rather than continue to eat the hamburger, you're probably going to want to throw it away and maybe even take to the streets and protest. That is your authentic reaction, the reaction to the golden retriever burger. That's the reaction that you have when you have not been, toward animals that you've not been conditioned by carnism to see differently. Carnism is basically requires us to act against our better judgment, to do things that we don't really agree with. And so it needs to use a set of psychological defense mechanisms. These are ways of thinking that distort our perceptions of the animals we've learned to classify as edible, and they disconnect us from our natural empathy from those animals so that we eat them without realizing that we are distorting our perceptions and that we're acting against our empathy. It basically numbs us. And I can talk a little bit later if you want about some of these defense mechanisms, but this is exactly why well-intentioned people who care about animals nevertheless eat animals and don't even realize, what's happening psychologically when they're engaged in that process. And understanding carnism and seeing it more clearly for what it is one way to help sort of free our minds from this deep conditioning, provides us more of an opportunity to live our lives more authentically.
So much fascinating stuff because, everything we touch on in this, permeates. As you were talking, I was thinking about, the detriment of not living a fully integrated life and what other ills may we create or endure, and what benefits do we avoid by not having an integrated view of life. It can't be healthy. I'm no psychologist, but if to keep it a little bit personal, I'm enduring and tolerating this inherent hypocrisy. Where else might the individual, in this case me, give himself a subconscious pass? Right. Well, what are the permutations of this discordant pair of beliefs operating out of one person? I probably should have put that as a question since I'm interviewing you, but it is an observation that it can't only impact our diet when we don't reconcile the various dichotomies of our belief systems.
Yeah, well, I think you said that beautifully, and I'm impressed. I mean, I've talked about this a lot, and rarely, if ever, does an interviewer actually make this connection. Certainly not right off the bat, and talk about the impact of sort of engaging in these destructive, dysfunctional thought processes beyond just how it affects our consumption of animals. And you're 100% right. There's a a great Buddhist quote that I love that says, we all have within us the seeds of greed, hatred, and desire. And we also have within us the seeds of love, compassion, and empathy. And our job is just to water the right seeds. And I think we can apply that to so many things. And, another author says, what we do, we get good at. And what we get good at, we do more. So the more we engage in dysfunctional thought processes, and I'll break them down for listeners who are wondering what I'm talking about when I talk about these defense mechanisms, but they're dysfunctional, to a large degree, dysfunctional thought processes that are, they're irrational. The more we engage in irrational ways of thinking, self-justification, denial, avoidance, projection, all of these problematic ways of thinking, the more we reinforce them in ourselves, we get good at them. They become normalized. We're much less likely to notice them when we're doing them in other domains of our lives. The more we disconnect ourselves from our natural empathy, the more we don't act in alignment with our compassion, the more we normalize that for ourselves. And there is spillover. And the good news is that the opposite is also true. The more we water the seeds of compassion in ourselves by doing our best, and I want to sort of avoid all or nothing thinking, but by doing our best to bring compassion into all of our relationships, we're always relating with others, whether it's our partner at home, or it's the animal we've chosen not to eat, or it's our dog, or, it's our neighbor. We're always relating. The more we can relate in a way that reflects our core values of compassion and fairness, and our sort of authentic being, essentially, our authentic, perceptions, the healthier and more integrated our lives are.
Finally, reading Atomic Habits, which of course has been around for quite a while and certainly is a very, very popular book. But I was struck by one of the things the author mentions, and that is, I think I'm saying it right, the Diderot effect. And it related to a prince back with Catherine the Great, who I guess had patronized him and his art. And at any rate, she gave him a nice couch. Well, then, the next thing he knew, well, gosh, I've got this nice couch. I better get a nice rug. And golly, all this is going into a crappy house. So he had to upgrade there. And that to me just kind of really touches on this a little bit, because if I begin to say, all right, I'm not going to betray myself here, well, then all of a sudden, maybe it emanates positively somewhere else. It kind of builds on it. So I'm putting dots together and connecting things even as we speak. But I can see certainly how that would inure perhaps to our betterment and the betterment of society. So.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about and when I talk a lot about, eating animals or not eating animals, shifting our diets, it's not just in the interest of the animals and the environment, it's also in our own interest, our own psychological interest. And I'm not saying that eating animals is, causing mental illness or anything like that. I'm simply saying that, when we exercise our compassion muscle, it gets stronger. And when we don't, it gets weaker. And we all want to kind of build up those parts of ourselves that we want more of in our lives, and that bring us greater fulfillment, greater joy, and have us have more fulfilling relationships in general, including a more fulfilling relationship with ourselves in many ways. It takes a lot of, I realized this when I stopped eating animals, and I could not have known it while I was eating animals. It frees up a lot of psychological energy. I didn't realize how much sort of background noise there was, because there was so much work in my mind, basically remaining blind to what was right in front of me every time I was eating. I was going through these mental gymnastics without realizing it, because they were operating like an operating system in the back of my mind. Maybe I should say a little bit more about Carnism and how it operates for listeners, so that I can ground this more in something practical and concrete for them, what I'm talking about with these mechanisms.
And there, ladies and gentlemen, you just heard the guest gently getting the host back on track. So thank you, Dr. Joy. Yes, let's thank you for turning the steering wheel back into the lane. Thank you.
Actually, I'm very deeply grateful that you brought up the points that you brought up, because I think they're fundamental. They're really central to the conversation. And often we run out of time and don't get to them. And I always hope that we can kind of come to these deeper core issues. So I appreciate it very much. Carnism is, it's a special kind of belief system. It's what we would call a dominant system. That means that it is so widespread that it's invisible, right? It's invisible. It's woven through carnistic beliefs, essentially, are woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, and our behaviors and all major social institutions. So, for example, when we study nutrition, we actually study carnistic nutrition. When we study medicine, we study carnistic medicine. Even veterinary medicine is carnistic. And when we are born into a system that is so widespread and that it's like invisible, we inevitably, it's like being fish in water, right? We inevitably learn to look at the world through the lens, through the eyes of the system. We internalize carnism. So we're born into this system and we internalize it. So when I was growing up, when I looked at a hamburger, I saw meat. I didn't see dead animals. Had I grown up as a Hindu, I would have seen something very different. But my perceptions were completely shaped by carnism. And so carnism is it's also a violent system. Meat cannot be procured without violence, no matter how we look at it. And, today, the way that animals are, raised and killed for food, we're talking about massive, just extensive violence toward animals. And most people would never willingly support a system like carnism. And frankly, even if the production of animal products were 90% less horrific and violent than it is, it would be 10% too much for most people who have empathy. They just wouldn't tolerate it. But most people do tolerate it because carnism, in order, like other systems, and it is structured like other isms, right? Classism, casteism, patriarchy, racism, and so on. My later work looked at the extension of my theory of carnism to these other systems. It is structured so that rational, caring people act against their own interests and their values and the interests of others without realizing what they're doing. And it does this by using these psychological mechanisms that I call them carnistic defenses that distort our perceptions, as I said, and disconnect us from our authentic feelings, most notably our empathy, when it comes to eating animals. So, for example, carnism teaches us to see farmed animals as abstractions, as lacking any individuality or personality of their own. So we learn to believe that a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. And carnism teaches us, essentially conditions us to see farmed animals as objects. So we refer to the chicken on our plate as something rather than someone. And carnism teaches us to place animals in rigid categories in our minds so that we can harbor very different feelings and carry out very different behaviors towards different types of species. We love our dogs, we eat pigs, and we don't even think about the contradiction in our attitudes and behaviors. One defense that happens to be, all these defenses are institutionalized. And one defense in particular is promoted by our social institutions. And that is the defense of justification. We need to, in order to eat animals, we need to be able to justify eating animals. And the way that we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of eating animals are the facts of eating animals. And there's a vast mythology surrounding eating animals, but all of these myths fall under what I refer to as the 3 ends of justification, that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And we learn this from practically all of our major social institutions, So, and not surprisingly, these same arguments have been used to justify practices throughout human history, from male dominance to heterosexual supremacy. We get the populace to support a practice that is causing widespread harm and suffering because they believe that doing so is normal, natural, and necessary. And you can see these beliefs are supported by science and the media and medicine and history. We've always been eating animals. Well, we haven't always been eating animals, actually. We have, however, been eating animals as long as we've been raping other humans and murdering other humans, but we don't invoke the longevity of these practices as a justification for them today. But so many of us just uncritically accept these myths that are really a widely held set of opinions as facts. And very often when somebody challenges these myths, they're called biased. And this is what happens. This is the way one of the ways dominant systems keep themselves alive, by pathologizing anybody who challenges the logic of the system. Well, if you challenge the bias, you must be biased.
Right. And one of the most glaring examples of what are the things you were talking about? I see it, Chipotle in Qdoba, where they don't even ask you anymore to choose your meat. They anodize it by saying, choose your protein, right? They don't even afford the animal the dignity of referring to it as a meat. It's merely a protein put entirely in anthropocentric terminology, which to me is just glaring.
You're listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. We'll be right back after this quick word from our sponsor.
This is Wayne Pacelli with Animal Wellness Action. We depend on countless people like you to support our fight for animals. Join us today by donating to further our campaigns to spare countless animals from cruel and needless pharmaceutical tests, put an end to animal fighting, liberate farm animals from extreme confinement, and so many others. Become a donor at any amount. Visit animalwellnessaction.org/donate to join our fight against animal cruelty of all kinds. That's animalwellnessaction.org/donate. Thank you.
Now, back to the Animal Wellness Podcast.
Let's say you raise a group of children, put them out in the wild, and they've never been exposed to carnism or meat eating. Do you think that there's a core component of human nature that would eventually take these people who had never heard about eating animals before and cause them to start eating animals? Or do you think if someone came into the world completely innocent, it would never occur to them to do that?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it makes me think of this quote, and I'm going to not do it justice by not quoting it exactly, but something like, if you put a baby in a playpen and you give them an apple and a bunny, which one do you think they'll eat and which one do you think they'd play with? But I mean, to your point, human beings, we of course have the capacity, I think you're asking something about human nature, right? And, what would we do? And when it comes to survival, it's a different issue, right? There's a somewhat different psychology involved when we're talking about having to cause harm in order to prevent harm, in order to stay alive. It's like the difference between if somebody is attacking you and they're going to kill you and you fight them off and you end up killing them to save yourself. That's quite a different psychology you're engaging than if you walked up behind somebody and shot them because there was some pleasure in it. So it's people in many places in the world, people eat animals not because, simply for pleasure. They do it because they have to survive. And I think that's not, once we get to the point where as a species, we no longer have to enact violence and harm in order for ourselves to be able to survive and to thrive, it becomes for us much more difficult to justify doing so. So going back to what I said about the three N's of justification, the N of necessity is probably the most important. And if you look at atrocities that have been committed, over the course of human history, you can see that these atrocities were made possible because the populace was essentially duped into believing that doing so was necessary for the survival of the race, the nation, the gender, and once the end of necessity weakens, the moral issue, it becomes the issue or the behavior takes on a moral dimension that it didn't have in quite the same way before. So, for example, at one point in human history, virtually all humans were dependent on eating animals. Today, many, many humans are not. Like those of us who are not hunting and gathering anymore, or who don't live in food deserts and have the economic ability to make our food choices freely, we don't have to eat animals anymore. And once you no longer have to do something, you start to become increasingly ethically uncomfortable with the behavior and really start to increasingly reflect on the ethics of your choices.
Right. And it's really hard, I think, to operate on this and this belief. I went vegan for a while, and I tell you, I gained a bunch of weight because it was not easy for me, living alone and single at the time, to do the kind of preparation and the planning that being healthfully vegan entailed. So I essentially became a pastatarian, right? And had a lot of rice and pasta and maybe some vegetables in it. It didn't go well. I don't think our culture makes it easy for people to make these kinds of choices. You can feed a family of 4 at McDonald's, for $25, let's say. But if you were to buy the groceries and have a healthy vegan meal, it might be a lot more expensive. So we don't make it easy, even if we determine it's not necessary. What could be done about that?
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really important point. And, unfortunately, many of the behaviors that are necessary for us to cultivate if we hope to have healthy bodies and lives and a healthy society are not rewarded. And they're like, it's more difficult. Generally, when we engage in behaviors that cause harm to the planet and to others, we're rewarded for those. I mean, if you look at people who have some of the most money in the world, they didn't get that way because they were practicing compassion. And so the bar is fortunately getting lower. It depends on where you live in the world, right? But it's certainly, for many people, it's easier today than ever to make choices that do not involve animal products. I remember when I first stopped eating animals, and it was back in the day where it's like soy milk was like water. It was like chalky water, and all we had was tofu and just plain tofu. There wasn't much more. And now, depending on where you are, but in many places, just mainstream grocery stores have entire sections that are just loaded with, vegan variations on animal products. And then, of course, you can always eat without animal products, and it's less expensive and healthier. If you're eating beans, for instance, instead of, processed vegan products. I think your question speaks to a bigger issue, which is how society needs to be restructured in a way to encourage and make, as my friend Tobias Lehnert, another author, says, to make compassion easier for people, just to make it easier to make compassionate choices. And part of it is getting informed, because there are ways to do this that are not as problematic as they may seem. And part of it is also, I always recommend that people just try to be as vegan as possible. If everyone in the world were as vegan as possible, the world would be vegan fairly quickly, because this raises demand for, it reduces demand for animal products, carnistic products, and it increases demand for plant-based products. And of course, there's more to it than just that. But I think, we often assume, understandably, but inaccurately, in my opinion, that either you're vegan and you're part of the solution, or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. And I think this prevents 99 or 98% of the global population from supporting a cause that needs all the help it can get, and from moving along the spectrum toward veganism in a way that's sustainable for them. And I think when people truly commit to being as vegan as possible, it takes away the pressure of all or nothing. It allows them to do what my friend Kathy Freston, another author, says, which is to crowd out the carnistic products rather than cutting them out. So, you just bring in more plant products and you have less room for animal products. And it helps us to become allies, in ending carnism. And I can talk more about vegan allies later, but I just wanted to put that one point out there.
No, I think that's great. And I often find myself hoisted on that petard, all or nothing, right? I went out with my wife, and she loves steak, and gosh, I had a steak, so therefore, why bother, at all? So I like your comment about, a graded approach, being more vegan maybe you can make the switch from dairy milk to almond milk, which I've done, and just cut it out here or there every little bit, at least philosophically, helps. How much in the West is your advocacy hindered by the prevailing, I think I'm going to say, Western belief that, man was given dominion over animals by God, and therefore in this culture, animals are strictly a utilitarian benefit from their divine creator. Do you encounter that mindset specifically in any of your work?
I mean, sometimes if I've, in the past when I've given talks and there have been sort of some religious, people in the audience, but rarely. That is a prevailing belief among many people, and because many religions are carnistic. Again, like religions are institutions, and many institutions are carnistic. That said, my experience is that I have never met somebody who has deep religious convictions who actually is open to the idea of reducing their consumption or eliminating their consumption of animals, who has said, oh, I would love to do this, but my religion forbids it. Generally, people evoke religious beliefs as a justification for what they've already decided, which is that they don't want to, or they're not ready or willing to move along the spectrum to stop eating animals or to reduce their consumption of animals. I think, impact is really important here, where we think less in terms of sort of moral purity and more in terms of what kind of world do we want to create. And, and I think most people listening here, probably everybody, would agree we want to reduce harm and suffering to animals as much as possible, right? That's the impact we want to have. And, to honor our own process in this, where on one hand, like you're pointing out with yourself, and I really admire and deeply appreciate your honesty about your own personal struggles with this issue. And I think many, many people can relate to it. It's probably great for people to hear you talk about this so openly. Most people would say, boy, I do not want to cause any harm to animals. Why would I ever want to cause harm to animals? And yet, we've all been born into the system. We're conditioned, to find certain foods appealing. Even when we kind of recognize that they come from dead animals and we get a little grossed out by them, it still might not even be enough. We're worried about maybe rocking the boat of our important relationships. You said your wife eats steak, and, some people have entire, family systems built around maybe even killing animals. And it's hard for people to make a total change. If we ask ourselves, how can I have the most impact possible with my life to reducing harm to animals? It doesn't have to look like only not eating them. I mean, it's great if people can reduce their own consumption of them. And as I said, just ask yourself, how vegan can you make each meal be? Just be as vegan as possible. Number one. Number two, be a vegan ally. And when we look at social movements, right, in history, and we're talking about as a movement for animals. I mean, this is part of the animal justice movement, essentially, which is to end the exploitation of sentient beings, of animals. And the primary way that the vast majority of animals who are being exploited are farmed animals. So you want to be a part of that, and you're not ready to be fully vegan, you can be a vegan, be an ally. And most social movements don't succeed just because there's some core inner group of hardcore activists. They succeed because they've attracted enough people who are allies and who are willing to be allies and say that they're allies. Be a vegan ally. Use your influence however you can to help raise awareness. Support the concept of it. Even if you're not vegan, support it. That's great. Let's go for it. Vote for legislation. Donate to organizations that are doing this work, that can only do this work because they get donations. There are lots of ways that people can use their influence. And some of the people who I have observed, doing the most for animals are people who they're not vegan. They're people like my publishers. My book is in 23 languages now. Many of those publishers are not vegan, and they're proud vegan allies. And they publish the book and they push it out and they get me in front of huge mainstream media. And some of those journalists, many of those journalists interviewing me, that coverage with hundreds of thousands of people, they're not vegan, but they love the fact that they can help support the cause.
So we've talked about being a vegan ally and then cutting down on it. What else, as we get to the end of the half hour, 40 minutes I mentioned we would take, what else would you say to people listening to this? And I would imagine many, I would say if you're listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast, you have an interest in the well-being of animals. I would suspect many perhaps are straddling the two worlds. What would be your final, comments to those people?
I mean, first of all, just the fact that people are, concerned about and committed to animal wellness, that's just already something that is so important, and the world just needs so much more of that. And I commend everyone who is doing their part to help make the world a better place for animals, because the animals of this world are suffering terribly. I guess a way to explain this is to, you kind of have to get outside the carnistic box. And so imagine most of us would consider it cruel to slaughter a happy, healthy golden retriever just because we like the way her legs taste, right? And would say, well, she's had a good life, which makes it even worse in some ways because she wanted to keep living and wasn't just being put out of misery. But when the same thing is done to individuals of other species, carnism conditions us to think of that, and particularly animal agribusiness conditions us to think of that as compassionate. And I think that way of thinking, I understand it, and I think it warrants more investigation. And my interest is in, really encouraging or inviting people to try to shift your thinking, learn more about carnism and how it's influenced you, because the more you see the system for what it is, the less impact it has on you. The more you free your mind from it, and the more you can make choices that reflect what you authentically think and feel rather than what you've been taught to think and feel. So get informed, and you can learn more at carnism.org, my website. And also, if you want to be raising awareness, and talking to people about this issue, we also offer trainings for people, because one of the things that carnism does to keep itself alive is it conditions people to feel defensive against anyone or anything that would get them out of the carnistic box. Very often you hear somebody say, I'm vegan, and then just the conversation shuts down. It's like, oh my God, don't talk to me, you're vegan. Or they get projected on with all these stereotypes. You're anti-human, you're overly emotional, and all these things. It can be very difficult to have open, connecting, rational conversations. So we at veganadvocacy.org, there are a lot of resources for people either who are vegan or who just are vegan supporters, who want to be able to better communicate about this issue and raise awareness and do justice to the conversation in a way that helps and ultimately end the problem of farmed animal exploitation.
Thank you for listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and follow Animal Wellness Action on Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. To stay current with all of our news and information, and to take action to help animals, sign up at animalwellnessaction.org. Until next time, remember, helping animals helps us all.